All right, today we are going to go over Urbanization. It is Chapter 19 in Open Stax, Chapter 20 in the Cat Crash Course. Urbanization is one of the major trends that's happening during the Gilded Age. There is almost a flip from, rural to urban. After or before the Civil War, it was primarily rural residents. And then by the time we get to 1920, it is like 50-50. So cities that are growing at this time, New York City is the one we're going to be focusing on. It is the one that people give the most examples of, but it is happening all over. It is also including New Orleans, which isn't on here, but so yeah. So factors that are leading to urbanization are pretty similar to the factors that were leading to industrialization, like electric lighting. This is allowing and increased services. Telephone is allowing for communication to come to the cities from the outside. This is also a major factor in the development of offices and retail stores. Transportation is allowing not just the cities to grow, but what we're going to look at later, which are like streetcar suburbs. And steel and the relatively inexpensive, strong steel is going to allow for us to build up with the skyscrapers. This is going to, in skyscrapers, the elevator, these are going to allow for increased density in the cities, and businesses are going to organize so that, the top of these buildings are going to have your managers, then you're going to have your sales offices, and you might have a store. And so it is allowing for increased, offices and businesses in the CBDs, but also increase in housing. Housing is one of the major issues. We're going to be looking at an increase in immigration, and as people are moving into the cities, the infrastructure is not there to house them. Tenements are going to be where many of the poor working class are going to be living. These are like the Lower East Side, or of New York is the biggest example. But they are housing where they are right next to each other. There's very little ventilation. There's a lot of disease. There would not be really a lot of running water or toilets for everyone who are living in this. So an average working class family of 6 would have about like 2 bedrooms at the most, and they would be packed in close to each other with very little running water, very little like trash going out, and so there is a lot of disease. It is also a fire hazard, as people if anything caught, it would go straight up, and it is crowded. So tenements are what we call the housing for in the inner cities. Jacob Riis took a look at these tenement living in his book How the Other Half Lives, and he is using photography to expose the conditions to help promote change in this tenements. Other people who are looking to change and help with the tenement living are a lot of women who believe, is the social gospel, which is, Christians start to kind of focus on love thy neighbor. And whereas like social Darwinism was like, just let them go, that's where they need to be, is in the gutter. Social gospel is like, as a good Christian, you should help people. And so churches are going to begin to reach out to people with like the Salvation Army or the YMCA to try to help the urban poor. And this is kind of like that, like, what would Jesus do? And so preachers are starting to encourage Americans of all classes to work together for the betterment of all, including those who are living in the inner city. Women are also getting involved in this. So it's primarily women, but these are college-educated, middle-class women who are involved in social work, and they are getting involved in what is called the settlement houses. The biggest example of one is Jane Addams and the Hull House. They would give childcare, evening classes, libraries, gym facilities, healthcare, and it's very similar to social gospel, and a lot of them were, involved in that as well. But it is trying to provide relief to families in the inner city. So the Great Migration is happening as well. The Great Migration is going to be coming from the South into the cities. One side note is that it's not just going to northern cities. People are also moving from rural areas to urban areas in the South. So, for example, this is when a lot of folks move to New Orleans from the rural areas. But then people are moving to the North and the West for opportunity. The push factors that, although after the Civil War, African Americans were supposed to have equal rights under the 14th Amendment, slavery was supposed to end under the 13th Amendment, and they were supposed to have the right to vote under the 15th Amendment. But this is not really happening. Folks are living under segregation, under Plessy v. Ferguson. They are tied to the land with debt bondage and sharecropping, and the literacy test and poll taxes are keeping them from voting. And there's also violence that is happening to keep them down. The pull into like places like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia is a perceived lack of, there's a lack of like legal segregation. We will look later at, whether or not how segregation continues, but there is a growing industrialization and jobs and better educational opportunities for their family. So folks are starting to flee the South into the North and East. The main reason why cities are growing is new immigrants. People are coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. These are what we call new immigrants. These are folks coming from Italy, Greece, and Russia, Poland, these sorts of places. There are many push and pull factors. The pull factors are the same factors as to why the Great Migration was happening. It is jobs, it is industrialization, it is opportunity. The push depends on what country they're coming from, but usually it's like religious, political, or racial persecution, and war. Then these new immigrants are different than many of the others. They are tending to be staying in the port cities like New York City. They are primarily uneducated and lower class. Many of them cannot speak English. And 80% of the population of New York was foreign-born or children of foreign-born by 1890, and this is a large increase. Between 1900 and 1910, 9 million people immigrate to the United States, and folks are going to try to start to organize this immigration. In 1892, we're going to create Ellis Island and this Bureau of Immigration where we start to keep track of and use doctors to look over new immigrants. And at that time, only 2% of the immigrants are denied entry. So we begin with Ellis Island. And then when folks come in, they tend to live in what we're calling ethnic enclaves, Little Italy, Chinatown. In these places, you would have your local language and papers. You would have food stores that have your food from your culture, bars and restaurants where you could hang out with your friends and community. It also is a way of protection from outside threats, but they are often cramped slums, and it's because it's all they can afford. So one of the reasons why they need to live in ethnic enclaves is because they were often targets for hatred and discrimination. We looked at this example with Chinese Americans, but it's also happening with Italian Americans. One of the reasons why they are easily targeted is because of their religion. Many of these folks are Jewish or Catholic. They are speaking different languages. They have darker skin and different food. And so it becomes, people are focusing on new immigrants. And then they also start blaming them for, well, why are the cities so bad? Why is America going down? And they will look at like immigrants, and also with this idea of like social Darwinism, that it is these immigrants that are not the best immigrants. And that's why the cities are going downhill. So this is going to lead to immigration restrictions. In 1917, we're going to start with literacy tests. And then in 1921, we're going to have a quota, which actually starts to limit immigration, which is coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. So nativism is on the rise. People, like I said before, are kind of like pointing at these new immigrants and saying they are undesirable, and they are a threat to the moral fiber of the country. There's also going to be the American Protective Association, which is going to try to curb immigration. We looked before at the first successful limitation on immigration is the Chinese Exclusion Act, but they are going to go further later into having literacy tests in 1917 and the Quota Act of 1921, and then going on to the National Origins Act. It is a successful movement. If you look at immigration rates, they plummet, right? Right here are the new immigrants, Italy, Russia, Hungary, they are going to go down in the, here's when we start to do the immigration restriction. And all through the 30s, 40s, and even up until the 1960s, we have very limited immigration. So these quota acts are successful, and we curb immigration. In these cities, they are often run by political machines. Immigrants would look to their city bosses for services in order to get votes. This is often, we would call it corruptions. At the time, they call it graft. Oh my God, my cat is very needy. And so if you wanted to, say, have your, sidewalk expanded so you could have your stores, you would go to the city boss to get funds for the sidewalk. He would then employ one of his people. That person would charge the city an exorbitant rate, and he would give kickbacks to the political machine and the boss. And then because you got your sidewalk, you would vote for that boss. So machines are ways that things got done. It's almost like running your city like the mafia. But this is how the cities were working at the time. The working class is going to have their amusements. There are, with what little time they had off of work, they could go to places like Coney Islands. There are wild rides. There are freak shows. I don't know why the book mentions it. Electrocuting elephants. We can go into that in class. But anyway, these are kind of like bawdy, things like Coney Island. Other amusements targeted at the lower class are things like vaudeville. These are also going to be, they're basically, these are like almost like variety shows or operas. Houdini is going to become popular at the time. And minstrel shows, which is, commonly known as blackface, is also going to be the entertainment at the time. Spectator sports are also going to become a major attraction. Baseball becomes America's pastime. Football is on the rise. And a lot of these are kind of targeted more towards the working class, but other folks would go too. There is a rising middle class during the Gilded Age. These are people who are managers, salesmen, engineers, doctors, accountants. These are professionals. They are salaried. They are better compensated than the working class poor. While many of these people work in the cities, many of them in these office buildings that we're building, they are not living in the inner cities. They are living in what we're calling streetcar suburbs. And so they would take the streetcars to these like nicer neighborhoods with nicer houses, and they are separating themselves from the working class. This idea of separating themselves from the working class and kind of identifying with the upper class also plays out in their gender roles. Whereas with the working class, women and children had to work. The middle class are trying to maintain their gender roles. And there are a lot of popular magazines that are targeted at middle class women, things like Good Housekeeping. And so this is an extension of, the cult of domesticity. Women are supposed to be in charge of the home and children and the spiritual and social and cultural needs of society. And so magazines like Good Housekeeping are trying to, focus on women to have like a pride-worthy home. And these are, the middle class ideals. So when we get to consumer culture, a lot of it is targeted towards these women, buy this and, make your family happy. There is more educational opportunities for middle-class women. Women's colleges are going to be created. Some of them are created out of these elite colleges, would have, women's colleges associated with them. There are independent women's colleges like Mount Holyoke, Vassar, and Smith. Most women who go to these universities are going to get married, but they are also going to work as teachers, professors, and many of them who worked in what we looked at before, these settlement houses, went to women's colleges for their education in social work. Some of this stuff is going to be sort of tied in with the cult of domesticity because women are in charge of, caring professions. These are seen as like within their spheres. Education in general is going to be on the increase. A lot of it for the middle class, some of it for the working class. But because children often had to work, they are not going to be able to go to school for the working class. But there is an increase in school attendance. It goes from 7 million in 1870 to 21 million in 1920. And it is going to also change from this kind of old-fashioned one-room schoolhouse to kind of what we think of as schools today, where you're going to have different teachers for each grade. You're going to have, discipline-specific teachers. High schools are also going to be growing at this time. There is only 100 high schools in 1860 and over 6,000 by 1900. Public colleges are also going to be created, mostly targeted at this new middle class. A moral land grant gives schools money through land grants to build universities, things like Kansas State. Some of these educational institutions are going to become HBCUs, like Tuskegee University. But these colleges are targeted towards the middle class, where you are going to, where they could afford to send their kids. They could take business and, law and medicine. And, many of the elite are still going to send their kids to places like Harvard or Yale, what we call the Ivy League. And we'll get into that now. The upper class, the super rich, they are not, trying to mingle with the middle class. They're also really they are distancing themselves, especially from the working class. So whereas the working class would be going to vaudeville, the upper class is going to go to classical concerts and art museums. Andrew Carnegie is going to build Carnegie Hall in 1891, and this is going to be kind of the center of the cultural scene for these super elite. The super elite are going to take trips to Europe. Think of like the Titanic. They're also going to have multiple homes, many of them in these like very rich enclaves like Newport or Southampton. And so the super elite kind of are in a world, unto itself. Cities are also trying to create more planning. In Central Park in New York City is one example of this, where they are trying to provide a space for people to get away from the, stress of the inner city. People are also starting to plan wider streets and better, sewage and city services. So this is happening. As far as like changes in thought and, expression and culture, social Darwinism, we've already talked about. In literature and in philosophy, people are trying to kind of like try and figure out what is the reality of like, why are things the way they are? Not everyone went into social Darwinism. Some people did pragmatism, which is kind of like you need to experiment with different perspectives. And some people are really focusing on instrumentalism, which is, it is like the way that we can make society better is through education. So a lot of the like previous things about public school are through efforts like John Dewey to provide public education to everyone, because an informed American citizenry is what is the basis for needed progressive reforms. So people are on different paths as far as how they're going to deal with these things, and kind of like reflecting these realities of the Gilded Age becomes part of like art and literature. There's more of an emphasis on realism rather than this like romanticism. Photography is invented, and then like realism is trying to portray the kind of grittiness of life in the Gilded Age. Mark Twain does this, with things like Huckleberry Finn and some of his other works. And yeah, the Ashcan School is one of the schools that is known for, painting these harsh realities. There's also kind of focus on naturalism with this like social Darwinism, the kind of like harsh laws of nature. And so art is also reflecting differing philosophies of the day. There are a lot of critics of, the Gilded Age. One of them is Andrew Bellamy. He writes a book called Looking Backwards. He portrays a utopian America in the year 2000 that is like peace and harmony because we abandoned capitalism and moved to a socialist state. It is an interesting book. It's like he kind of looks at like he sees this advent of like credit cards and cable entertainment and supersized stores. But in his vision, it is a utopia that is like cooperatively owned. It is a really popular bestseller, and it's going to influence people like Eugene Debs, who turn to socialism as a alternative to the capitalist model. All right, so baseball is invented in 1876. We have a 10-story skyscraper in 1885. Electric trolley in 1887. Hull House, Jane Addams is in 1889. Jacob Riis publishes How the Other Half Lives in 1890. City Beautiful is in 1893. And Coney Island opens in 1895. All right, that's it. Take care.